Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to start by acknowledging the unceded Wolastoqiyik territory from which I speak today. I have commented in this House before about the importance of this recognition and, most importantly, the actions that must accompany it. There has never been a more important time to highlight this than with our discussion of Bill C-15, an act to implement the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples here in Canada, in a colonial country where land was extorted. In addition to threats and force, there were efforts to exterminate and bury the original peoples of this land. These efforts failed. Instead, they planted seeds, and what we are seeing is a reclamation, the ushering in of a new age. The time has come for reparations. Many of my colleagues in this House know that my children are Indigenous. I have also worked closely with hundreds of Indigenous youth as a teacher. They have informed my work every step of the way. When I think of voting on this bill, I ask myself, what will their world look like in 5 years, in 10 years, for the generations after them, with or without passing Bill C-15? Bill C-15 introduces the notion of a national action plan to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into Canadian law, with annual reporting mechanisms. It is important to note that the specifics of these measures are not articulated. This has brought with it uncertainty and a manifestation of a well-placed mistrust in government. What Bill C-15 does well is lay out a robust preamble with ambitious, frankly, incredible language. It includes value statements that acknowledge systemic discrimination and now racism, thanks to an important amendment. It recognizes self-determination of Indigenous peoples, including an acknowledgement of their legal systems. It actually says the Government of Canada rejects all forms of colonialism. It commits to advancing relations that are based on good faith and the principles of justice, democracy, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and the respect for human rights. Can we take these words at face value, or in good faith, as the bill proclaims? The criticisms of Bill C-15 are nuanced. The most obvious issue is this: the notion of good faith itself is on shaky ground. For a bill that enshrines the notion of free, prior, and informed consent, consultation is severely lacking. And I know that's a contested point, but I must say that I believe it was lacking. It is not enough to have closed-door meetings with national bodies or organizations. The individual rights holders have a right to be heard and to weigh in on legislation with such significant implications. All Canadians, Quebecois, and Indigenous peoples of this land require an understanding of the Declaration and what it truly means to affirm it as a universal international human rights instrument. A more complex problem some are having with this bill is that Indigenous people are tired of the gaslighting. Indigenous rights are inherent. You are born with them. No one can take them away from you. These rights have existed since time immemorial. And yet, Canadian history presents things as though Indigenous peoples were handed those rights with the coming into force of the 1982 Constitution Act. It's a nice idea, but it misses hundreds of years of colonialism and abuse rooted in the doctrine of discovery. The notion that the Crown holds sovereignty over Indigenous peoples, that Indigenous laws and legal traditions have no place, that the Crown has ultimate title to the land held in trust. These notions underpin all of Canadian law. They are embedded in the Canadian Charter, and they have placed the burden of labor on Indigenous peoples and nations to establish their rights in Canadian courts. C-15 also fails to enshrine a distinctions-based approach to implementing UNDRIP in Canada and stands more as pan-Indigenous legislation, disregarding the incredible diversity within Indigenous nations. It is possible that Bill C-15 may be a tool in the toolkit for future court cases, but I have to question what the future holds for Canada and Indigenous nationhood with this implication. Are we preparing for years of expensive legal battles? Are we asking once again for Indigenous people to bear the burden of proof in the protection of their collective inherent rights? What will happen with the Mi'kmaq fishery dispute, with a new season set to start in June? Fishers and leadership have had to call on the United Nations for protection from violence and racist intimidation. Will the passing of C-15 prevent this from happening? Will it remind the non-Indigenous fishers of their treaty obligations, of their history of settlement in Unama'ki? If BC's UNDRIP law is any indication, sadly, I don't think it will. I want to take a moment to talk about the journey I've been on when it comes to the study of this bill. My first step was with the Wolastoqiyik Grand Council under Grand Chiefs Pazakasip Pasazim and Wolastoqiyik Grandmothers. My next step was to meet with the Wabanaki Peace and Friendship Alliance. I reviewed numerous analysis and interpretations. I met with my honorable colleague from Winnipeg Centre to learn more about the work of Romeo Saganash with Bill C-262. I met with local community leadership. I met with our local friendship center. I met with the Association of Iroquois and Allied Nations, with my honorable colleague from Vancouver Granville. I met with the Assembly of First Nations and staff from Chief Bellegarde's office. I listened and I learned. My last stop was again with the Wolastoqiyik grandmothers, scholars, and leaders in my riding. I would encourage all members of this House to also seek out that guidance. The assertion of these critical voices from Fredericton, from my mentors and most trusted allies, is to reject Bill C-15 at third reading. This is not easy for me. The Green Party of Canada stands by the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we campaigned on passing it into law. However, that's not what C-15 will accomplish. I'm told to celebrate C-15 as it sets out the basic minimum standards for dignity and human rights for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples already have these rights, charter rights. They already have title to their land and to hunt and fish for their livelihoods. They already have the right to self-determination. Canadians are the ones that have a problem upholding these rights, and Canada fails to enforce them. We have a moral, legal, and fiduciary responsibility as a nation to uphold our laws, and we have broken these laws in pursuit of domination over Indigenous nations, and there is significant work ahead for dismantling these systems and structures of oppression that got us here. There are no easy fixes, and passing C-15 checked the box of reconciliation. Clarity on the implementation of UNDRIP would have been a golden opportunity to demonstrate what a new relationship could be, to demonstrate true respect and cooperation. Canada and sovereign Indigenous nations could continue a path in their own canoes, the lesson that the two-row wampum teaches us. It's 2021. It's time for us to face the truth. We cannot reconcile if we were never conciliatory. We can only work to repair the damage done. An essential part of these reparations is respecting the first treaty we as all humans have, the treaty with the land, with our planet. We forget far too often the interconnectedness of all life and our role and responsibility in preserving this place for future generations. What we have now is a race to consume resources. There is a component of this bill that reflects sustainable development, but what this conversation must include is a reevaluation of what that means. What is the value of protecting old growth forests, in food security, in cultural safety? How are we to measure the success of C-15? There are too many questions left unanswered. The study of C-15 has been a roller coaster ride for me, and I wish to recognize the immense privilege I have as a non-Indigenous person in pursuing this study. It has been difficult to see the infighting and division among people I look up to, among some of my personal heroes, and I want to say for the record that it's okay to support this bill, and it's okay to reject it. What is not okay is ignoring our role and responsibilities as treaty people and to treat each other with disrespect, which is a legacy that remains with or without this bill. Finally, whether C-15 receives royal assent or not will not determine the future for my children. They are Wolastoqiyik. They are people of the beautiful and bountiful river. They are rooted to this land. They know who they are, and they know their rights. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Honorable député.
The honourable member for.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. I would like to hear what she has to say about the fact that, well, what would she like to see more in federal legislation so that we could better respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and bring us to true reconciliation with Quebec and Canada?
Honourable member for Fredericton. The honourable member for.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, and I thank my colleague for the question. And I mean, really, it's a reiteration of what we've heard a little bit in this House as far as a more hands-off approach. Indigenous leadership and governance structures are ready to lead in their own right. That's what self-determination means. And so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is an excellent international covenant, and I stand by it. I stand by those principles. But this is a plan to implement the plan to enshrine it into law. So it just doesn't quite go far enough. And really, that consultation piece, I know it's highly debated and it's a hot topic. The people in my riding have not had that adequate consultation, so they should be the ones to steer the direction of what real reconciliation would look like. Thank you very much.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Crown Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her intervention, and I always appreciate her comments. But I do have to express a bit of disappointment in the position that she's taking. There's been extensive consultations with respect to 262. I was with Romeo Saganash in many communities, many travels during the I-9 committee, where many people came up and talked about his direct engagement. The foundation of C-15 is from 262, and our ministers and myself and other colleagues were part of extensive consultations across Canada, even during the pandemic. And in fact, the INAN study itself, we had many more who came forward and spoke. So I do believe we've had a wide range of consultations, extensive. It's not perfect, but extensive. But we cannot say that we support UNDRIP and in principle, but we are not ready to implement it. And I really would urge my colleague to reconsider her position, because this is
the historical moment. Honourable Member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. And I must reiterate my respect as well for Romeo Saganash and the work that he put in. But I have to say, in the extensive conversations I've had in my home province here in New Brunswick with the community members, with inherent rights holders, they don't know what this bill means. They don't know what the implications are. They have not had the adequate time to study the bill for themselves. These are scholars, activists, leaders. So to say that there's been extensive consultation and to talk to actual Indigenous people on the ground who have not been consulted, it just doesn't add up to me. And my role here is to represent Fredericton, and that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the honourable colleague for her speech. I don't think we agree on much often, but today we do. And my big criticism of the Liberals has been on this particular bill is to do what you say and say what you do. It doesn't come out any more clearer than we've done extensive consultation. When we went to committee, I sit on the committee, when we're at committee, everybody that appeared at committee had a recommendation for an amendment to the bill. All of the three major Indigenous.
I'm sorry, I have to cut the honourable member off because we only have 30 seconds left for an answer before time is up. The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. I don't know how much solace it brings me to be in agreement with the Conservative Party of Canada on some of these issues, but really, it's just to go back to that consultation piece. And the people that I care about, who I speak to on a daily basis, have not had that thorough consultation. And you're right, there were important amendments that were brought forward, and not all were adopted, including that important one about rights distinctions based, the diversity that exists across this country. To say that there's consensus on this bill is not true.
Comme il est